luz y la esperanza de cambiar.
Muchas gracias por asistir a al nuevo foro de economía. En esta oportunidad tengo el grato placer de presentar a Michael Scholder. Es un gran amigo mío con el que trabajé en Afganistán en 2012. Y déjenme decirles que Michael tiene 25 años de experiencia a nivel internacional, no solo en Estados Unidos, sino a nivel internacional. Como lo puse en las redes, manejó proyectos por un valor de $4 billones, energías renovables y en otro tipo de proyectos. Conoce un poco la historia de Bolivia, porque trabajó de cerca con la empresa estuvo involucrada en el gasoducto al Brasil. Y bueno, él accedió gentilmente a compartir algunas ideas del mundo financiero, pero desde una perspectiva muy práctica. Es decir, yo creo que es bueno conocer la parte teórica de las finanzas, pero lo que hará Michael es darnos su visión práctica, y es por eso que estuve durante muchas semanas pidiéndole por favor que se anime a dar esta charla, porque realmente creo que él nos puede contar muchas y muy buenas cosas. Quiero agradecer a Javier, a Raúl y a Alejandro por estar conmigo como panelistas, y bueno, el resto de invitados que estarán atendiendo este seminario. Todas las preguntas se hacen por una opción que tienen ahí de preguntas y respuestas, que se llama Q&A. Y ahora déjeme darle la bienvenida a Michael en inglés. Hi, Michael. Thank you very much for being here. I was telling to the panelists and the attendees that you are a very good friend of mine. We've been in Afghanistan in 2012, almost 10 years, and I consider you one of the best professionals regarding the financial sector. And one of the idea of this economic forum was to have you as a guest to tell us about your practical experience with the modeling and finance. I told to the attendees that you've been working on financial projects around the world for more than 25 years. You manage 4 billion USD projects, so you have a lot of experience that you can share with us. And I really thank you, and I appreciate that you are taking your time to present these ideas and tell to the participants that Michael prepared these presentations for 3 to 4 weeks ahead. So because he's like that, he's a very formal person. So I will be managing the PPT and I will be managing the Excel files if you want to share with us the examples. And now the floor is yours, dear Michael. When you want to share your PPT, please let me know. Please, Michael, go ahead.
Again, I'm honored to speak with you today and to share some of the insights from my career. I plan to go slide by slide and to give you context for each one, but I will not read them to you. You can read them now or later. I just want to give you some perspective on each slide. And perhaps sort of an overview perspective is that throughout life, we tend to learn things the hard way by making mistakes. Some sage wisdom from my father is a wise man learns from other people's mistakes. So I'm going to share some that might be mine, and certainly others as well when it comes to financial modeling. So basically, financial models were developed as a tool to analyze projects competing for limited capital. I'm sorry, Mauricio, can you move to the next slide? Okay. So when looking at different models, you need metrics in order to compare the results of different projects from different sponsors, from both the investors and the lenders' standpoint. Qualitative reviews are also critical companions to show the full picture. Qualitative reviews could be the topic of numerous presentations. far too in-depth for today's presentation. I did reference one study prepared by Standard & Poor's as a possible approach for a qualitative analysis. I've also included a quote from a famous statistician, George Box, who tells us all models are wrong, but some are useful. What's important is to understand that models help us see the potential outcomes, but we never will see, the model will never show us the actual results. The next slide, please. So now we're on the third slide, is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. To put it very simply, many businesses have ideas, but they need more money to realize those ideas. Other businesses have money, but they need ideas in order to generate profits, either from dividends and or from loans. Each of those businesses will either have employees or contractors who will prepare the financial analysis and the models, and they'll try to persuade their employers that the project is attractive from an owner, investor, or from a lender's perspective. Next slide. I'm not, is this the key parameter slide? Okay, so now talking about the key parameters or the structure of a model. And in this case, we're going to take energy projects as a sample. So ideally, the model should be comprised of three primary areas. The first is an itemization of the incremental construction costs, plus the sources of the information for those numbers. The next important area are the financial statements. A full set of financial statements should be prepared, which would include an income statement, a cash flow statement, along with a balance sheet. These statements are important because they enable the owner, the investor, and the lender to see how the results could impact their own financial situations. For example, with an owner, they want to make sure that the project is producing sufficient cash flow to meet their expenses and to cover their requirements in terms of debt service, and also that any investors are getting adequate returns. From an income standpoint, the investors will want to make sure that if there's negative cash flow in the early years, that there's not an adverse impact on their earnings, particularly if they're a public company. So they have to be very careful when they invest in a project. They ideally do not want negative impact to their earnings if they're consolidating the financial results from the project on their own financial statements. And then there should also be a comprehensive summary of the financial results. And this should be used by the project sponsor because it's often the situation that they'll have multiple opportunities. They'll have to pick and choose how to spend their time and their money. And then once they have identified their most attractive opportunities, they can use those results to solicit the lenders and the investors that they will need in order to implement the project.
So now we're on the sheet where it talks about financial modeling for entrepreneurs and developers. Is that correct?
We are on the key parameter for energy project model.
Oh, okay. All right. So if we can now, so yeah, basically I have made my comments for that slide. So if we can now move over to the next slide.
Okay, the next slide is financial modeling for entrepreneurs, developers.
Correct. So the role of the financial modelers is to collect and organize the key numbers from the appropriate experts. And what I have shown here is an example of the types of experts that the modeler would approach to collect the information that they would need. And they'll need, for example, they'll need to get an accurate forecast of the construction costs, what the operations cost would be. They need to understand what the output, forecast output, and the revenues from the production from the facility would be when they're provided to their customers. They'll need to understand what the requirements are from the lenders and investors in terms of what type rate of return is sufficiently attractive to an investor to convince them to invest money, and what sort of requirements from the lenders will be required, both for construction financing and then for permanent financing. Along with that, they'll need to know the appropriate accounting and tax impacts so that all of the participants in the project, either the owners or the equity investors, can understand how this project is going to impact them. Now, in the next slide, I am basically borrowing some best practices in financial modeling from a well-respected organization. And it's good, particularly if you don't have significant experience in financial modeling, or it's probably more important if you have some experience in financial modeling, but don't really follow their guidelines, to really take some time and look at what they're suggesting and then decide what is appropriate to do. So it's important that the financial model be very easy to follow, and particularly by third persons, and for someone who needs to audit the work. So an auditor or a manager should be able to look at the financial model from top to bottom and see how the inputs were collected and how all the numbers were processed in a straightforward, incremental order. There should be helpful hints or comments attached to the cells in the spreadsheet to aid those who are reviewing the model, or if the modeler is building lots of models and has set one aside and has brought it back now that some key numbers have been collected, then they can, the notes help to remind them why the model was built the way it was, and where those inputs go. It's also important that the results be transferred to a separate page, because often managers, executives, and investors and lenders really want to see the results first to understand, is this a screening process, and do we decide to spend more time on this or not, or if this is an advanced project, and what developments are there that there's the construction costs are now higher than expected, and what can be done about that. Perhaps other arrangements have to be made, some existing contracts renegotiated, and so it's good to have the key results plus the key inputs and the calculated results, so that they can understand what the drivers are for those particular results. So on the next page, if we can advance to finding a balance. So the goal for the modeler is to provide enough information to easily see why the project is good or why it is not. Do the revenues rise? Do they fall? Do they stay constant, and why? And that should be highlighted and clear, so that when someone is looking at it, they can see that, well, perhaps there's an escalator factor on your sales price, or B, there's a degradation factor that you're expecting. One of the things that surprised a lot of wind power projects for example, is they would model that their project would run for 20 years and always produce 100%. But that is in hindsight, it's a naive expectation or assumption, because dust, rust, lubricant contaminants, everything, metal fatigue is going to impact the project. And you'll expect to see a steady, well, it might not be a smooth slope decline, but you will not have, perfect 100% operation. You're going to have some variation. And particularly with projects, for example, the project that Mauricio and I worked on in Afghanistan, the assumption was they were going to take natural gas from some gas wells, which had poisonous hydrogen sulfide. The hydrogen sulfide had to be stripped out and processed in a safe manner. Then the gas would be going into what is called a combined cycle gas turbine project. And so part of the gas is combusted in the combustion turbine, and then the waste heat goes through a heat exchanger and then into a steam generator, and then produces electricity. But what happens is that over time, the combustion will leave waste byproducts within the turbines, and they basically will decline over time. They'll need to be cleaned, and so people who would model combustion turbine projects would produce what was called the sawtooth, which you'd see the productivity of the facility decline over time. Then there'd be a periodic overhaul. The results would get close to, but not 100%, and then it would start to decline again, then be another overhaul, and on and on. Projects like solar projects and wind power projects are less likely to have major overhauls and changes. They would probably just have that periodic decline over time. So both when anyone looks through the model, they should be able to, again, identify what is that is happening and why things are changing. The projects have to have good cash flows, because first they have to pay their expenses, then they have to pay their lenders, then they have to make distributions to their investors. And what happens in many projects are that there's a lot of time in negotiation and adjustment to come up with a loan structure, and then an equity payout structure that recognizes what the outcome of the project will be over time. For example, on the wind power project, you would expect a small, steady decline over time of the life of the project. Therefore, that type of project would be better suited with a loan amortization, where the total of the interest and principal declined over time to match the declining expected output. Now, there could be other factors. There could be escalation factors on the revenues tied to various things that, for example, competing electricity might be provided by fossil fuel plants. And if fossil fuel costs are going up, then perhaps there should be a commensurate bonus to the wind power project, because the utility has been spared the volatility of the fossil fuels. But the flip side is that if there's a decline in the price of petroleum, the wind power project obviously cannot compensate. And so more typically their escalation might only be tied to something like inflation and things of that nature. What's also critical is to have sensitivity analyses. And this gets back a little bit to the point about all models are wrong, but some are useful. Because
excuse me, Michael, now, which is the title of the slide you are looking now?
Find a balance with enough but not too much information.
Okay, excellent. Perfect.
Okay.
Go on.
And so this is my last point on that slide, is it's very important to have sensitivity analyses to understand the magnitude of significant variations in controlling, in controllable and uncontrollable factors. For example, I worked on hydroelectric projects, I worked on wind power projects, and the amount of precipitation that occurs every year is not average, it's not flat. There's significant variations. For a hydroelectric project, you might need, you might not be able to really go with what sort of the average of the last 100 years of precipitation is, because there's the possibility you could get hit with a 5-year drought, as we're currently experiencing in California. So it's not reasonable to take just the average of the last 100 years. You need to have some sensitivity analyses for uncontrollable factors, like what the precipitation might be from a year-to-year basis. Even with wind projects, the wind from day to day, the amount of wind, the velocity, things of that factor varies, and so you want these sensitivity analyses. But to see some things are within your control, but some things are not, are outside. All right, so if we can now go to the next slide.
Okay, the next is like calculated returns for lenders and investors.
Correct. So the first thing lenders want is to be repaid, and they focus on the debt service coverage ratios. Debt service coverage ratios are simply the total amount of cash that's available after paying expenses divided by what the debt service is in that year. They will focus both on the average and on the minimum, and they'll have certain requirements depending on the technology. You know, for example, a project that if it used oil to operate, well, there's variations in the market price of oil over time. There might be some hedging, but they may not, the sponsors may not want to hedge 100% of the oil or find it prohibitively expensive. And so they'll want to, as I mentioned earlier, they'll want to run some sensitivity analyses with that. And in the case of, for example, a rating agency, they may simply say, well, we're going to assume that the price of gas or oil that you're using in your plant is going to be 50% higher than what you're forecasting. And then they'll look at what the debt coverage ratios are and see if that project is still viable, if it can still manage to repay the loan. Another calculation that lenders are interested in, particularly when the lender retains all or most of the portion of the loan, that means they don't syndicate it out, or it's not a bond financing where they sell the bonds to third parties, is they want to see the payback calculation, because they are very reluctant to structure a loan in a situation where the owner has basically collected, gotten a return of 100% of their money, but for example, in a 5-year loan, if there was a 20-year loan and the investor has managed to recoup 100% of his money in 5 years, and then the banker is still on the hook for another 15 years, they're very uncomfortable with that situation. They'd be much more comfortable, if it was the investor was not, closer to break even, closer to the halfway point, perhaps at 10 years, or they may choose to syndicate the loan and just maintain smaller portions of the loan and spread the risk, depending on the particular project and the reputation of the borrower. And finally, when looking at projects, you should look at it both on a before and an after-tax basis, so you understand what the impact will be, as well as on a leveraged and unleveraged basis. And even though you might not intend to develop a project, or you're sponsor may not want a project without a loan, it's still important because often there'll be numerous different projects competing for the time and the money of the organization. And if there's a project that has an 8-year life and one has a 20-year life, and they have significantly different annual cash flows, it's hard on a leverage basis to compare them just looking at the IRRs. But if you look at them on an unleveraged basis, it gives you a better idea what the overall strength of the project is, and on an either or basis, which project is better to pursue for the organization. All right, so
in the financial modeler for entrepreneurs, developers face many challenges.
Correct. And so what it's important to understand here is that, I'm sorry, let me just adjust something, is that there's pressure from the project leader and for the organization to have projects that work. And I've been in several organizations, and there are various reasons why a developer wants to pursue a particular project. It could be for their own personal gain, for job security, for a promotion, things of that nature. And so it's important that you try to be as objective as possible, and treat them well, but understand that it's you're also looking out for the organization, and you want to protect them from pursuing projects that are not appropriate. The next factor is to avoid misleading the organization if there's a significant problem in the model and the results for the project appear very good, but that in fact, due to an error somewhere buried in the model that no one noticed, the company is now pursuing a project that's actually not viable. A third area to focus on is the fact that it's fairly common to find that everybody within an organization is busy. And if you go to, for example, the electrical engineer and you need a cost estimate for a substation, that they may just give you a number off the top of their head, and claim they're really busy. But it's really incumbent upon you to be diligent and try to pin them down and try to collect more information if possible. Or if it's just not convenient at that time, take the information that they give you and then circle back later without sharing any results, so that you can really understand what's happening, but also to provide a degree of almost insurance or whatever protection is to build in a contingency. If you get a top of the head figure like, oh, $25 million for a substation, well, you can ask, well, really? So 25 million, that's a lot. What costs so much? And see if you can tease them into sharing. Well, you need this component and that component, and et cetera, et cetera. But it likely can be an iterative process to collect all the information that you need over time. Another challenge is that it's very common for people to be too optimistic when it comes to schedules, that it very often takes much longer to get construction permits, to get licenses for the importation of key equipment, and actually to complete construction. Here, an example is that Mauricio and I both worked on a project in Afghanistan where they twice tried to rehabilitate some gas wells. And the first time, after a 2-year effort, they managed to get one of the drilling rigs to the wellhead, and then time and money ran out. The second time, after a 2 or 3 year effort, they got a drilling rig on site, actually got it operating, but were not actually able to complete the first well. So 2 attempts that actually accomplished nothing because there was underestimation of time to get critical equipment through the border, and just not realizing the inefficiencies. And then also an area that I constantly struggle with as a person in retirement is wondering, what is happening with interest rates? What is happening with inflation? What is happening with exchange rates? You know, is my money going to go far enough? Are costs going to keep going up? And we have been in over the last decade, an unprecedented time period with lower interest rates, lower inflation rates, relatively calm foreign exchange rates on from a big picture basis. But I think that there's a good likelihood that the 2% inflation levels that many have been appearing in models for the last several years, and the very low interest rates may start creeping higher in the future. And a lot of projects that could survive with those low rates are going to have difficulty realizing the results that were expected. And finally, it's very easy to want to prepare a deterministic model. And by that, it's one that just says A times B equals C, and these are the results. But as I've tried to highlight, and going back to Mr. Box again, is that we're just making estimations using the information that's currently available, and we can have some idea of some things that might happen. For example, we might be able to say, well, we could do a sensitivity analysis and say, well, if the market interest rate is a certain level when we go to put the term loan in place, this would be the impact. And you could vary that by a few percentage points or basis points, or you could also factor in some other things. But what you couldn't, for example, people in 2019 were probably not factoring a COVID-19 pandemic into their financial models, where everything shut down, supply chains were disrupted, and by using a stochastic analysis, where it's going to take the situations that might not be contemplated and throw several of those at you, and then produce through, for example, a Monte Carlo simulation, you could see, well, here's a range of possible outcomes, with things going very well or things going very badly, and then, you know, look with what is within the, and typically you get a bell-shaped curve distribution, a normal distribution of the outcomes, and if most of the outcomes are within the acceptable range, the project could be pursued. However, it also opens your eyes about some of the negative aspects, and then you may want to spend a little bit more time on your sensitivity analyses. All right, so next slide.
Here, all models are wrong, but some are useful.
Correct. So basically, what we're trying to do with a financial model is to create an illustration of what could happen if the project proceeds as expected. And the model, the goal of the model is to show the likely range of outcomes to facilitate a decision. You know, and here I've included one of Mr. Box's quotes, is that, you know, the most a model could do is to supply an approximation of reality. And you're never really going to know how projects are going to turn out. There's going to be more or less rain, more or less wind. Project costs are going to be higher or lower. There's just a number of factors, and they really only help at the beginning. One of the challenges particularly for power and other large infrastructure projects, is that by and large, cost can go up over time, but they typically have signed contracts where they cannot get additional revenues, and so they have to be very careful with their modeling, because they don't get an opportunity after the fact to go back and recognize that, well, our inflation escalation factor on our revenues is not really quite sufficient. We need a higher number. The utility will say, well, that's the price we agreed to. We expect you to deliver. And so it's very critical that sensitivity analysis are done, and so you have an understanding of what the impact can be. And the stochastic analysis, as I described earlier, so many factors that are beyond our control have to be are sometimes better considered through a stochastic analysis. Here are some of the avoiding traps for modelers. Is the next slide?
Yes, avoiding traps for modelers.
Okay. And here are just some thoughts about how to deal with situations that you may encounter. Yeah, one of the first power companies that I worked with, I was often asked to do a quick and dirty analysis. And it's basically that's they just want a screening analysis, and they wanted to find out whether or not this project is possibly within a range that could be viable or not. And so it's very important when you do those projects that you be careful, presenting the outcomes, because basically, and at the early stage, the numbers that you're given are not very good, and you don't want to say that yes, if, for example, the company's target return is 15% after-tax IRR, you don't want to come back and say, yes, this project meets it, because it's generally far too early. The numbers are preliminary, and you don't want to mislead a sponsor. I had a project that I did one time where, yes, it did hit the 15% hurdle rate. And then the project sponsor said, oh, well, actually, I think the cost for the dam is going to be higher than that. Oh, and I think the substation and the transmission line, we're going to have to pay for that instead of utility. And so even though all these costs started increasing, in their mind, it hit the 15% hurdle rate. And so you want to be helpful and diplomatic, because you're simply giving them a reflection of their numbers. These are not your numbers. And so they want to, you want to take steps to get the best numbers and avoid misleading these people with inaccurate preliminary numbers. And one way to do this that I found helpful is if you can put significant contingency figures in, particularly in the early stages, and then later, because it's almost common to find out certain items were forgotten in a cost estimate, or they were badly underestimated, or they have now found some new unanticipated cost that they've never encountered before. And if there's enough contingency built into the construction cost and to the operating expenses, then the possibility that the project can absorb those. But if it's already borderline slipping below the threshold and there's no contingency, then the viable project has become unviable, and that's not a message anyone wants to convey to a person who's been working on a project for a while. So on the next page is what went wrong. And so these are some real world examples of the things that happened to people that I know and that I personally experienced. So the first one was unfortunately, a situation with a fatal flaw in an error in a spreadsheet. And this was that there was a proposed solar power project in India. A lot of time and effort had been spent in preliminary and advanced engineering, and lots of travel costs and lots of time speaking with the utility, and lots of costs were incurred. And then they found that, in fact, there was a flaw in the model, and the project wasn't close to making the required hurdle rate of return. And so it just had to be abandoned. And so the important part here is to be, thorough and have your, in preparing your financial model, but also have it audited and try to catch those mistakes and not have the embarrassment and be the cause for a project of wasted time and cost pursuing a project. In another situation, one of my employers was pursuing a hydroelectric project, but they had unfortunately underestimated the costs. And then when the costs started coming in, and this particular hydro project required a lot of what's called penstock, which is the pipe that conveys the water from the dam down to the hydropower turbines. They simply underestimated it, and we were fortunate in this case that some of the steel sections pipe could be replaced by far less expensive ductile iron when it wasn't under a high pressure, and therefore the project was able to move ahead despite the additional costs. Another situation I encountered in a project in the Philippines was a couple of test bores were made on site to determine what the subsurface conditions were and what sort of foundation would be required for a power project that was would be built using very large diesel engines that would be running on heavy fuel oil. And the large diesel engines would be vibrating a lot, and the preference was to have the foundations built upon bedrock. This was just a situation of bad luck. A couple of test bores were made. They found rock, just below the soil surface, and they were very happy and could go with a less expensive foundation design. When they started excavating, they found out that they were had unfortunately hit two boulders, that bedrock was far deeper, and they needed a far different and far more expensive foundation structure. And in that situation, the owner just had to cover the increases. On another large power project of a similar design in the Philippines, the construction contractor actually completed the project construction earlier, and when the tests were run to verify that the output of the plant met the minimum, it in fact exceeded the output requirement by 5%, and the owner demanded a bonus for both early completion and for delivering more power from the project than had been contracted. The problem was that in a typical situation, if a project starts earlier, then the owner saves interest during construction, and that reduces its cost, and that's advantageous. But in this particular project, they were what's known as build, operate, transfer. So the owner would build the project, operate it, and transfer it after 10 years. So the time savings in construction did not extend the time period in which they could operate and generate revenue. It simply accelerated the time, to turn the plant over to the utility. Also, the power purchase contract was for a set amount. I think it was 100 megawatts. So even if the project produced 105 megawatts, there was no buyer of the additional output. And unfortunately, in order to avoid a legal dispute, the owner of the project simply, well, I worked with the owner of the project. We borrowed additional debt because the project could support it. And then the owner's results were slightly lower than they would have been. The final example here that I'm showing is one of the worst examples that I'm personally aware. And I was working for BHP Billiton, which is a global miner and petroleum company. And they had, one of their scientists had developed a technology for taking iron ore and running it through a giant system in which they would heat natural gas to a high temperature, and then under extremely high pressure, the system looked somewhat like a radiator in design with, you know, many loops up and down. And then what would happen is that the natural gas, as it moved through in one direction and the iron ore was blown through in the other direction, is that the iron would separate out, and then they would produce 99% pure iron briquettes that they could sell to steel producers. And they were so ambitious and optimistic that they started one project in Australia, and then the second project, which was in Venezuela, where the iron ore prices were modest, the natural gas prices were modest, the electricity costs were modest, and so based on the financial model, it looked like a great project. Unfortunately, when they finally got the Australian project up and operating, they found out that what worked in the test laboratory at 1/20th scale didn't work so well at full scale, and that did not produce 99% pure iron briquettes. Very often it would produce briquettes that were 99% pure on the outside, but often had sand and other contaminants on the inside. And further, the metal sales department was completely off base in terms of the market price that they could sell the good briquettes for, because surprisingly in the steel smelting process, impurities, for example, from scrap metal taken from a junkyard, the impurities actually aided in the smelting process, and that without those impurities, the 99% pure or whatever briquettes were in fact now selling at a discount to scrap metal. And so the financial results were terrible, and BHP Billiton ended up with a couple of multi-billion-dollar write-offs on those projects. Now, those were not the faults necessarily of the modelers, but in hindsight, clearly there should have been some due diligence performed, you know, at each step along the way, and not just assuming that if the metal sales department thought it would sell for a certain price and they could sell a certain quantity, that those numbers shouldn't be challenged. So going on to the conclusions page, it's very important that you do not participate unwittingly in a camouflaging of a bad project. When a financial model is prepared, it can look very impressive, and it could also disguise a project just because the impressiveness of the numbers and the graphs and the sensitivity analyses, and someone who isn't familiar with building financial models can get the impression that this this project, well, it looks beautiful. It must be good. In fact, a financial spreadsheet's nothing more than a forecast of possibilities. And so it's important to be diligent because their uneconomic project ideas are widespread and continuous. Modelers have to work to help separate the good projects from the bad projects quickly. And at the same time, they need to be diplomatic when they are trying to help the organization quickly move away from the bad projects, because there are going to be project sponsors who are going to be disappointed that their project's not being pursued. But it's more important that the organization not waste a lot of time and money pursuing a project that's not acceptable. A little bit of sage advice that Mauricio may remember from Afghanistan, from our former boss, was assume nothing. So please never accept that the numbers collected are correct, but try to investigate and confirm that the numbers are in fact reasonable. With the internet now and so much information readily available, it really is important to just double check that you're really helping build a project that's good and valuable. And then finally, when and where possible, try to incorporate some tricks of the trade, such as being able to put some contingency numbers into the models in ways that are not obvious. If they're too obvious, the manager who reviews the numbers, like, oh, that 20% contingency number is way too big. It should only be 5. I've done these projects before, and we didn't even use the 5%. But unfortunately, this time, he wasn't counting on a COVID pandemic. He wasn't counting on certain other things, the return of inflation, etc. And so it's important that you try to maintain those contingency numbers. As I've shown you before, just with a few examples where I have personal experience, there's plenty of things that can go wrong, plenty more that can go wrong rather than right. So are there, at this point, any questions? Or I additionally have a couple of sample Excel files just to show you, sort of use as examples of what's bad, what's good, and things to be conscious of.
Thank you very much, Michael. I think was a great presentation. Before going to the Excel files, let me do some comments in Spanish, and I will do my questions to you in English a little bit. Muchas gracias, Michael. Yo creo que lo importante de la presentación de Michael es ver que una cosa son las fórmulas, los números, todo lo que uno aprende en la universidad en términos de construcción de indicadores, modelaje, pero lo que Michael nos está mostrando acá es que en la vida real, la verdad, uno tiene que lidiar con otros problemas más allá de si un indicador es bueno o malo. Uno debe lidiar con los problemas de jefes que quieren que un proyecto salga adelante, uno debe lidiar con costos no estimados correctamente, con pruebas teóricas hechas en laboratorios que finalmente no funcionaron en la vida real. Entonces, no estamos diciendo acá que la parte teórica no sirve, al contrario, uno debe salir, creo, muy bien con una base teórica muy buena, porque no hay oportunidad luego para discutir o que uno aprenda qué es un valor presente neto, una tasa interna de retorno. Lo que estamos diciendo acá es que en la vida real, eso uno da por sentado que conoce. Los problemas vienen con este tipo de contingencias en el relacionamiento humano, en los costos, qué sé yo. Entonces, yo le haría a Michael esta pregunta antes de ceder la palabra a las otras personas. Okay, Michael, I was telling to the people that one of the values of your presentation is that you are showing us that in real life, it's not a matter of which indicator is good, which indicator is bad, if the net present value is better than IRR. what you are showing us is that you have a lot of contingencies rather than the theoretical or the financial indicators. You are dealing with bosses that have some personal issues, with costs that are higher, with theoretical experiments that worked on the laboratory but didn't work on the real life. So what we are looking right now is that one thing is what you learn in the university, when you have to deal with all the math, the financial indicators, and so on. But the other thing is go to the real life, where you deal with people, you deal with companies that they don't care many times about the real project. They only care about to move on with the project because they will get, for example, one bonus from this project. So maybe you can elaborate a little more with the issue that in the real life you are facing problems that are not really the university problems regarding the financial indicators or which formulas are better than other. You are dealing with personal issues, with the delays on the project, with people with which is very difficult to work, as we experienced in Afghanistan, as you remember. Please.
Yes, I mean, it basically, when you are modeling, you know, you're trying to help people if they, but they might not really understand how you're helping them. They may assume you're helping them show that their project is a good one. And you want to be supportive and but objective, because you don't want to have that preconceived notion that it is a good project. You don't know. You need to be the scientist. You need to go in and try to collect the data as best you can on a polite and diplomatic basis, but you're really working for the organization, because the organization doesn't want to waste time and money pursuing bad projects. And then just, it's a matter of, I've seen, various things. For example, when I first got into the energy business, the way the organization was structured was they had engineers who were running the project models, and all of them were smart and good at math, and they could figure out which variables to start adjusting to make a project look attractive. So, they may have they know if I stretch out the loan, if I go from a 10-year to a 12 or a 15-year loan, and if I increase the output, assuming, maybe this engine can operate 98% of the time instead of just 95% of the time. If they tinker with it enough, they can make the project look good. But when one of the roles that I had was to help come in and help try to standardize it and develop one template that everyone would use. And the engineers, my background was in finance, and I was the one who led the way deciding what the appropriate loan term would be, the loan structure, and what the interest rate would be, because that was my background. It was not their background. And then once we adopted that approach, they were able to more quickly look through all of their projects and decide, it wasn't now an effort to change the numbers, the variables in the model to get to the 15% IRR. It was an effort of, trying to put the numbers in the most realistic presentation and quickly say it works or it doesn't work. And if it doesn't work, let's look for another project. In another organization where I worked, they actually had to move the financial modelers. They had to separate them from the project sponsors and then have a manager of financial models, because the project sponsors were getting bonuses tied to the NPV of the project. And so obviously they wanted all of their projects to move ahead. They wanted to collect all of their bonuses. And so they would go pressure the analyst, you know, to make their project was good. They pound the table and tell them, you know, it was their responsibility to make that project happen. And that's not the situation. Obviously, you know, dealing with someone who's a superior in the organization, you have to be careful and diplomatic. But, you know, here they actually had to have a manager who would be the traffic cop and said, no, unacceptable. We've run the numbers, we've checked them. Go find another project because this one's dead.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Alejandro Mercado, which is one of our professors, says, I learned many things. Excellent presentations. Congratulations, Michael. Thank you very much, Alejandro. And I have from Liliana Terrazas, any advice for a non-profit project to be sustainable? Thank you. I believe she's dealing with a non-profit project, like, I don't know, a social project. So how can it will be sustainable from an economic point of view, maybe?
Well, I'd need to have a lot more information about the type of project it was, what its funding sources were, what its target goals were, and then whether or not it could achieve those target goals in a reasonable fashion. Could she elaborate on the project?
Maybe we can ask to Liliana if she can elaborate a little bit. Do we have questions from Javier, maybe Raúl, or the other people? You can make your questions through the message or the Q&A option. But in the meantime, I would like to, if you can elaborate more, this example when the project went wrong because everything worked okay on the laboratory, and then when they went to the real world, it never happened. So we can see now how many things work okay on the university's laboratories, but when you go out in a big scale, the project, it doesn't work.
I'm not sure how, if it's primarily in the mining industry, because I also did work on a, I think it was called an ammonia leach project for a copper mine in Chile, where BHP Billiton was also the sponsor. And apparently engineers or production managers are always seeking to find more economical ways of extracting, either extracting the ore from the ground or extracting, well, in the case of copper, what they would do is they would, quote, concentrate it. So they would take it from maybe 2 or 3% copper per ton, and then they would concentrate it up to perhaps 20% of the volume, and then they'd put that on the ship, and it would go off to Japan or to one of the other large copper smelters, and so the goal was how to get it from the natural state to the more concentrated state in the most economical manner. One of these processes was called ammonia leach. I can't really get into the details, but that was also one that apparently worked okay in the laboratory, but at full scale didn't quite hit its requirements. In the power industry, there tends to be more more objective long-term information. For example, with combustion turbines or steam turbines or diesel engines, they have long operating histories. In general, the manufacturers are always trying to find some sort of improvement so that they can be more profitable in producing the machines, or that they're more profitable for the purchaser, and so that they can maintain or increase their market share. So they do tweak things, and so they have their engineers are also busy, and a turbine operates. It's think of like a jet engine on an airplane with vanes that are spinning, and if they can make those longer and thinner and still produce do the job, then they can increase the overall performance. But often they will they find out what the limits of the metallurgy is, and sometimes they produce products that operate for a while and then fail. Another technology issue related back in the Philippines was that a diesel engine manufacturer who primarily did tugboat engines saw the power generation field as an area where they thought they could be competitive, and so they persuaded my employer to purchase their machines for 2 different locations in the Philippines. But now the engines, instead of operating like a tugboat engine, which is a few hours at a time, they were now going to be required to run 24 hours a day, and they were also going to be operating on heavy fuel oil. And what happened was the projects was built, the diesel engines were put in place, they started running, and they started failing, because the projects that had been designed to operate inside a tugboat, which is already operating in water, and so it's a ready source of cooling, things of that nature, were now being stressed in a different way. And in that particular situation, they were under warranty, but there was a lot of lost time as they were continually having to redesign the cylinder heads of these diesel engines so that they could handle the stress of operating in the hot and humid environment of the Philippines, and of operating on a 24/7 basis. So one of the operating engineers jokingly referred to our power plant as the R&D facility for this diesel manufacturer.
Thank you very much, Michael. We are now on the last stage. Leonardo Siles, one of our students, says, "Thanks, Michael, for telling us these new things that we don't learn in our classes. I will keep the assume nothing advice." I think this is a very good advice. Assume nothing. Always be cautious on that. And one of our professors says, which skills and competences could be desirable for the students that are interested in the finance areas, apart from the economic background? And I will link this question to the final question. And let me say first in Spanish, then in English. Lo que Javier está preguntando es qué competencias, qué habilidades deben tener los chicos para trabajar en el área financiera. Y lo que quiero que Michael me comente es la idea que tengo, que los problemas que enfrentamos en Bolivia o en países en desarrollo son realmente muy parecidos a los que se enfrentan en Estados Unidos, Europa o Asia, donde tenemos que enfrentar problemas con la gente, con la tecnología, qué sé yo. Entonces, estamos muy cercanos en ese sentido, que al final somos seres humanos todos y tenemos nuestras propias idiosincrasias, sí, por países, pero los problemas siguen siendo los mismos. Michael, what I was telling to the attendees is that the problems that we faced in developing countries seems very similar to the problems that you face in US, in Europe, Asia, Africa, because at the end you are dealing with persons, human beings that have the same goals, the same objectives, and sometimes it's maybe very difficult to work to have a teamwork because many people, many different way of think. So maybe you can elaborate on this final question, please.
Well, I think I would agree that there's really not a big difference between projects in developed and developing countries. They're both working with, they have similar technology and human relations issues. The bigger problems probably come more out in the qualitative analysis. For example, you might want the way this is addressed in by the national lenders, the Inter-American Development Bank, the World Bank, and others, is there's a country risk spread, which is really sort of it's a political risk adder that if there's the perception of greater risk in a particular area, that's going to translate into a shorter, well, a slightly higher interest rate, tougher loan terms, and perhaps a shorter length of the loan. The similar, I mean, there's an example perhaps that I can give is I worked on a project in China, and it was a combustion turbine power plant. It was going to be fueled by diesel fuel, so that is not the least expensive fuel available, but at this particular Chinese island, it was what you could generally access. The utility was primarily getting power from hydroelectric projects, but they had an extended drought period and they were not getting enough power to operate the way they needed to. So they solicited companies to come in and build these standalone thermal power plants. When I came into started working on the project, there were a couple of key features. One was that the utilities contract was going to be backed both from a performance standpoint and for an availability of foreign exchange by a major Chinese bank. So the credit risk of non-performance and also the risk of the unavailability of foreign exchange to that particular utility were going to be transferred to a bank which was in a better position, to make payments and to make foreign exchange. What was discovered as this project proceeded was that there was not what's considered sanctity of contract, is that you agree to the terms of the contract with a counterparty, you shake hands, and you say, great, we just signed the contract, this project will be successful and we'll get an attractive rate of return. And then you get a phone call the next morning telling you from the utility saying, oh, they can't do that deal. And you get called back and then you renegotiate and then you get squeezed a little bit more. but you can finally do that project. Okay, great. And then a week later, you get another phone call like, no, well, they thought they could do the project, but they couldn't. So you renegotiate for the third and final time, threatening, this is it. You know, if you don't sign it, if you abrogate this, it's over. So that finally gets signed. Construction starts, and it's proceeding. Project goes into operation, and fortuitously, it's a very rainy year. And the hydropower plants are producing all the electricity the island needs. And here is this very expensive contract and with power plants, there are two components. There's what's called the capacity factor and the energy factor. And you can kind of think of it like renting a car. If you rent a car, you have to pay, the rental price for the car. If you use the car, well, you have to pay for the gasoline. If you choose not to drive your car, that's fine. But the bank still wants you to make payments on the car. The power plant's the same way. They wanted the payments for capacity. The power is there, and if you take it, then you pay for taking the fuel. But the fuel is typically a pass-through. There's not really profit there. You're just breaking even. The capacity payment pays the fixed operating costs, the debt service, and the return to investors. And so what happened in this situation was the utility the phone call this time didn't come from the utility. It came from the local government who said that utility doesn't exist anymore. But we have this new utility, and if you'd like a contract with them, then you can, we're willing to offer you this rate. So there's a situation where you had a lack of sanctity of, and the key omission I failed to mention is that the promised bank guarantee for performance and the guarantee for the availability of foreign exchange was never delivered. So there was no credit support behind the utility's commitment. If there had been, then the power plant owner could have just said, that's fine, I'm going to the bank and I'm going to collect my money from them. But in this situation, as the project was getting very close to completion and the bank was, just not interested in giving such a guarantee, the project sponsor wanted the project to move ahead. And so he convinced everyone that it wasn't necessary. That was at the same time, and I was the primary advocate for that because I had looked at the situation and China's, failure to really comply with what their commitments had been in the past. And that's when I chose to leave that company. And sure enough, like as I said, the first year when they didn't need the power, they didn't want to pay it, they reneged on the contract.
Thank you very much, Marco. It could be, I can talk with you as we did in Afghanistan many hours, but
Yes.
But now I think we are now okay. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for sharing your ideas with us, especially with the students. And I hope we keep in touch. I don't know if you want to say some final words.
Yes. I hope that my presentation has not scared anybody off from pursuing a career opportunity as a financial modeler. I think what's most important is that you go into situations with your eyes wide open. You understand. You probably gained the technical proficiency from your professors, but it's also good to speak with some people who have been in the industry for a while, so that you have a proper perspective. and with the technical skills and with the, you know, a little bit of a perspective, some insights from someone who's been there, you should be successful in your endeavors.
Thank you very much. Let me say some words in Spanish. Muchas gracias, Michael. Lo que Michael dijo al final fue muy bueno, que espero no haberles asustado, dijo, en hacer esto de finanzas, pero sin olvidar lo que les enseñaron sus profesores, también es bueno tener consejos de la gente de la industria que estuvo trabajando y ha estado trabajando muchos años y tienen experiencia en el manejo de este tipo de problemas que Michael nos comentó. Muchas gracias a ustedes por atender. Tengan una buena noche. Thank you, Michael, for being with us. Let's keep in touch. Thank you very much. Hasta luego,
Okay.
Michael.
Thank you. Hasta luego, Mauricio.
La divina fuerza de la libertad, levantando a Bolivia y crecer en hermandad. La Católica es tu universidad, construyendo el camino de la luz y la verdad. La Católica es tu universidad, construyendo el camino de la ciencia y la verdad.